Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to.
So today, our topic is about user experience and UX research and how to get the most out of your user researcher, whether that's you or someone else. And joining us to explore this topic is a good friend of mine, Paul McInerney, who is a senior user experience consultant at Interpix Design. Paul has a lot of experience working with product managers, and I asked him to be our guest today to share his insights on how you can get more value from your engagement with a researcher. Paul, welcome to Product AMA, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thanks, Lee. Happy to be here.
Great. So I'd like to start, and I usually like to start by asking about your journey to where you got to today. And in your case, it's user experience or UX research. Now, I know you did a BA at Waterloo in psychology on human factors and human-computer interaction specialization, and then you went on to do a master's in user experience design and human factors. So I'm curious to understand what led you into the study of psychology originally, and then into computer interaction specifically.
Sure, thanks. Well, I know a lot of people in product management, they have these very interesting stories of how they got here. They started somewhere else, and through a lot of different, sort of fortuitous steps, they found themselves in product management. Unfortunately, I don't have such an interesting story to share. In my experience, my journey's been very linear and boring. I was a co-op student at Waterloo, as you mentioned. And one day I was in the meeting with my co-op advisor, and the phone rings, so he picks it up, and I'm just sitting there, and he's talking to someone on the phone, and he puts them on hold, and he looks at me and he says, "Do you want do you want to have a co-op job at IBM?" I said, "Sure." So he gets back on the phone. "Okay, I've got someone. I'll send them over." So my job at IBM was as a student was as a usability tester, and I said, "This is great. This is a great fusion between my interest in psychology and understanding how people think and behave, and sort of the technology, and just been doing it ever since." So it's been
neat. Have you been? I mean, were you involved in computer technology, earlier that helped with that?
Well, I took. I took courses at school in the subject just as I guess electives, but wasn't. I mean, it was interesting, but it wasn't like especially interesting. I said, "Oh, I could." I remember doing programming of different types. I thought, "Oh, this is fun," but I'm not sure if I want to do this all day or not. But it's fun enough for a while. So yeah, and so. What
started that connection for you between how people behave and use technology?
Yeah, well, I hadn't really thought of it until I was exposed to it in that position, and then when I saw this, so this is just once the connection was there, so of course this is it was very relevant. And one connection is certainly in the early days of the field, there was really a metaphor of you're having a dialogue between yourself and a computer. And so insights about how, people converse or communicate among themselves, try to use those metaphors to say, how can we try and replicate that in the, with the computer? So, to the extent you have insights into how humans do it, then you could try to do that.
Right.
And now that I think about it, that's been a lot of the themes of my interest. So some of the topics I'm interested in is, trust and automation. So there's a lot of people in behavioral sciences that study the nature of trust and what does that take. And then, certainly in these days, there's a lot of types of application where, first, when the web came out and now with other sort of developments, there's an issue of trust in that interaction. So having that background on that subject is useful.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's come back around to that, because I think that's something that would be definitely interesting to go deeper into. But step back a bit and sort of give us a an understanding of user research? Like, is that, how would you define it? And are there sort of specific approaches to it? And then we can apply that to product management. So maybe give us a definition if you can, or from your perspective anyway.
Sure. I'm trying to think of the best way to grab onto this, but certainly I would say, addressing most product management audiences today, they're very well versed in user research. They've seen it done, or they do it themselves to some degree or other. So I'm assuming I'm talking to an audience that has done, sort of knows some amount of this. But I would say it's kind of a subset of user experience where, for the overall user experience discipline, you're trying to understand the technology from the user perspective, and part of that is you want to do research to understand that, and the other part is now that I understand, I want to design a solution that meets that. So I would say it's one of a couple of, if you break the generalist field of user experience down, that research would be sort of one side of that. Mm-hmm. And I would say as well, there's a historical perspective to that as well, that may be useful to look at. So originally, when I started, like, user experience was user research. It wasn't called that. It was called usability testing. That's what it was. Is user experience meant testing this thing to find out how people reacted to it and how we could fix it. And then later it became just anything to do with the user throughout the whole life cycle, like starting from requirements. Okay, do we understand the requirements from a user perspective? We're going to design the experience, and then we're going to test it. So in that sort of era, it was sort of a generalist role. And then later, in the current day, that's been split up again, said, well, there's just too much to know and do, like to take this thing from end to end. So we're going to, it's been more common to specialize now. So someone's, it's going to do more of the research side. They're going to talk to users, and someone's going to be more the design side. They're going to be, with their, working in Sketch and PowerPoint or Photoshop and whatnot. And so that's kind of how things have evolved sort of historically.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense, because clearly there's a sort of set of analytic skills in the research side of it, sort of that almost scientific method, whereas the design side obviously uses a lot of that, but relies maybe more on the creative and aesthetic sense, right, or functional sense. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Neat. So was there, I guess, when we talk about it in terms of product management, help us understand what are the sort of the characteristics, of, that vary based on, the type of customer you have, say B2B or B2C or other sort of, aspects of product management. How does research differ in some of those, or does it?
Yeah. So I would say a lot of answers to questions about user research is pretty much the same as in product management. You could, flip out or take out product management and put in user research. So you could ask the question is, in product management, how does product management differ in B2B and B2C? And I would say it's similar ways from a research perspective. So there's a lot of commonality across. There's a lot of concepts and methods and practices that doesn't really matter if it's B2B or B2C or whatnot, but there's some nuances and details and emphasis that differ. So my own background is I've done mostly B2B sort of work, and in that context, so I do a lot. So in that context, the buyer and the user are usually different people. So that's kind of one thing, and also. When you're trying to understand someone's interaction with the system, your perspective that you're adopting is, these people are in a job role, they have a certain job to do, and they're in an organization, and there's a business process. So the thing you're looking at is embedded in all these other things, and you're trying to understand those things and how they fit in. versus, in B2C, you don't really have those kind of layers of things. So.
Interesting. And are there differences between the kind of research methodology you would use for a new innovation versus sort of enhancing an existing legacy product or something like that?
I wouldn't say like at the highest level it wouldn't be different, but there'd be the details of how you do it would be different. So especially, let's take interviews as a method. So that's a very flexible method. You could do all kinds of different interviews for different purposes. So if you were on a project where you're doing something new and innovative, you would probably design your interview in a certain way. But if you're working on the latest refinement of a very established product, your interviews would probably be somewhat different. And another, I guess, a distinction along that from a research perspective is whether the research is sort of a one-off study or it's like an ongoing long-term cadence of things. So, and a lot of us, and myself included, have sort of worked in different projects where our role's been different. So, it's like I say, in some cases you're coming in, just out of the cold and say, hey, there's this product you never heard of and this team you never heard of, and they need this research on this thing. And so you're going to go about it in a certain way. In other cases, you're embedded with a team for weeks or months or even years, and you know them very well, and you've got the sort of the cadence is, it's more about repeatability and efficiency and that sort of thing. So yeah, so there's all kinds of different contexts for that you find yourself in as a researcher that cause you to emphasize different things.
But I guess at the sort of core of it, it always starts with a question or a hypothesis, right? And you're doing the research. Then the research design is around trying to understand the elements of that question or hypothesis, right?
Yeah. So like a way I break down sort of a research activity would be into three things. But the first one would be the research plan, and the three things you want to answer in a plan is like exactly like what are the what is the hypothesis or question or objectives or however you want to phrase it. Who are the participants and what method are we going to use to sort of engage with those participants? So those are the things that in sort of the in the research planning phase, you're trying to sort of sort those things out.
Yeah. So we'll come back around to that in a moment, but let's go back to some of these roles. And I'm really curious about your perspective of what's changed or evolved over the kind of span of your career, or my career for that matter. We're fairly similar, and in the sense that when I started, product managers really did most of the research themselves. I mean, it was fairly rare that you had access to some skilled research, person or source. Unless, of course, you were in B2C, and sometimes then you're using, focus groups or things like that. But now we're seeing skilled user researchers as a more common role on product teams, along with working with product managers and designers and developers. So from your perspective, what's changed and evolved over the last decade or so that has influenced this shift that includes user research in the product team?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I guess to go back to my previous question, I sort of I gave a historical view of how the roles evolved, and as to why it's evolved. I can't really say what caused it to evolve in that particular way. But I've and I think and it's I think there's some parallels between sort of how the product management field has evolved as well. So I guess we're both in the larger evolution of just the whole, in my case, sort of software industry and how that's evolved. Another, one thing I sometimes think about is, just in terms of the engineering side, how that, the roles there have evolved. There used to be sort of generalists, we call today full stack developers, and now it's more common. People are more specialized. I'm a front end person or a back end person. And I think that's another part of how roles have evolved or not. Yeah, so I think there's some, I guess there's pushing and pulling, because on the one side there are these more specialist roles, but on the other hand there's sort of paradigms like agile, which really go against that. They say, we don't want all these specialists, we want generalists, and everybody pitches in to get the job done. So there's these, I guess, in the culture we have, there's these different pushes and pulls to pull us in different directions, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess from, I have my own opinion about it, but I guess what I've seen over the years is that product management, along with sort of development and a waterfall methodology, has moved gradually towards a more, let's say, kind of scientific method approach, right? Mm-hmm. We, as market-driven product management emerged out of technology-driven, product, we started to understand the importance of research and data and understanding the problem before building a solution, right? As opposed to, having a solution, sort of come out of the IBM lab, for example, and then try to figure out who to sell it to, right? But yeah, I think I see it as a sort of natural evolution in terms of the specialization, as you mentioned, but also the raising recognition of how important research is and discovery to unearthing opportunities to innovate, right?
Yeah. And maybe I could just mention, I think there's all kinds of research, and there's in terms of specialization. So I would say there's kind of product management style research, and there's marketing research, and then user research, which there's some overlap, but I think they're fairly different. So I'm certainly aware of the kind of research that people in product management do in terms of looking at trends and opportunities and use cases and that kind of thing. And I wouldn't say I'm much in that space. Nor there's people that look at market opportunities and that sort of thing. Again, I still wouldn't say user research in that space. Really, user research is in the space, but so I guess one I would say thing that makes user research unique is that a lot of other researchers are focused more on the buyer, like the customer is really I don't really care who uses the thing, but I care who's going to sign the check and make me money. But user research, we're sort of on the other side. Is we don't care who bought the thing, but some guy sitting in front of it trying to get his job done or her job done, and can they do it? So I would say, and not that there's like 100% sort of distinction there, but it's certainly a matter of emphasis and difference. So
we call it user research rather than buyer research, right?
Right. Yeah. So, and this comes in and a lot of the methods, well, I guess it's sort of like bacteria or whatever, but there's just a lot of genetic intermingling between different fields, but certainly a lot of ideas from our field have found their way into other fields, like personas, for example. And so like one common, I guess, point of confusion is when there's a persona, they say, well, is this the buyer or the user? And people say, well, does it matter? Or why does it matter? And from our point of view, it matters a lot, and it could be the same person, but like if you're trying to describe the buyer characteristics, that's kind of one sort of thing. But if you're trying to talk about their usage characteristics, that's a pretty different thing. Course, even if it's the same person,
Right, of course. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Just to everyone that's participating and on the line here, I'm talking to Paul about user research, and we'd love to have your questions in the Zoom chat. So please put those questions in there, and we'll get around to them pretty soon. So just Paul, just one more question about kind of that sort of product manager doing research. What are there situations where, or benefits to a product manager, doing their own user research, or what's that balance between the research that they should do versus, leveraging a skilled specialist in user research?
Yeah. Well, I would say if you're in an organization that has that resource available, I just can't think of any reason, why you wouldn't want to use them. A lot of product managers I've worked with, they're certainly interested in knowledgeable and like to do it, but they often, they say, I just I'm just overwhelmed here with all my other 5,000 things I need to do, and I just can't get to this as much as I would like to. So, so I just can't imagine, what, as a product manager, why you wouldn't want to do that, leverage that resource. But I would say that, and it's not that it's like not like a fire and forget sort of thing where you just, like a turnkey thing where you just hand off, say, have this question, go find the answer, come back to me. It's really like a product manager ought to be, heavily involved in any user research that the user researcher is doing. Like that, the user researcher may do the heavy lifting, but if you want to get value as a product manager from it, you need to be heavily invested in sort of what's going on there. So
right. I think, I mean, the product manager is really the one that has the question, and it's leveraging the skill of a specialist who understands how to design a research, project and get the right information or data, right? But I guess the other part that I was curious about, and maybe it's a slightly different discussion, but there's if I do research myself, I have a kind of level of empathy with what I'm finding out, and how does a user experience researcher kind of capture that or can they capture it in the same way?
So I think what you're saying is if you do the research yourself, then you're bought into the results because you saw sort of how you got them and it all makes sense to you.
Or biased.
You're biased, but you make a good point that if you're, that's quite a different experience than if, someone just dumps a report on your desk and say top findings. It's like, you say, well, you may have trouble sort of, coming around to that. And researcher, it's very important to have the stakeholders involved because that is a very common thing where if people aren't involved, like they're going to be fairly cold to the results generally. And really like to get value from the, from the results, it's really useful to be there, all the way through to see sort of, how we got here, I would say. So I would say it behooves both the researcher and the product manager to work as a partnership through it, because at the end, otherwise there's a risk of both people being unhappy. Is the product manager says, "Oh, I'm not really buying these results, and I just wasted my time because this guy's not listening to me here." And
definitely, potentially missing some of the nuances. So it's like many other things. Communication and collaboration is critical, right?
Yeah. Part of sharing research results is sort of a persuasion exercise. You have to persuade people that, this is a new, different way of thinking of things, perhaps that you're expecting. And like I was saying, that product managers are aware, probably more aware than most people, of the difficulties and challenges of persuading people of anything.
Interesting. So we are getting some questions. So I'll try to sort of interweave some of those to address people's interests. And this is actually a question from Zeke, who this question has come up before, and I guess it's, since you have experience with this in research, you probably have a good perspective on it. But a lot of product managers are challenged with the process of recruiting and whether to provide incentive for participants, especially in the B2B space. Can you talk about how you've done that successfully, or are there any sort of guidelines on what works well?
Sure, yeah. So recruiting is sort of the dirty secret of user research. It's all fun until you have to go recruit somebody. And that's a good reason. And I think that's why a lot of sort of do-it-yourself efforts stumble, is people just have trouble with the recruiting. And so that's what I do a fair amount of. So one, in terms of working with a researcher, one issue is the researcher and the product manager being clear on who's responsible for doing the recruiting. And I've worked with product managers who tend to be very helpful, and they say, "Well, don't worry, I'll recruit some people for you." But they find it's often harder than they thought it was going to be. So I try to discourage them from doing that. I said, well, let me take care of it. But so there is, I mean, any researcher will ought to guide the product manager through the process. In terms of B2B, well, there's two flavors of B2B. There's your actual customers that you have a relationship with, and you generally, it depends, but sort of, a lot of companies would look askance to their employees being paid by some other company for whatever reason, like especially during business hours. Another approach is just to recruit people that fit your profile, to participate on their own time and reach them through channels other than through their company. So those are the two things. And in the last few years anyway, that's become a lot easier because there's services, web-based services that you can recruit from and say, I'm looking for this very specialized kind of person, and you have to pay them obviously. But they seem to have pretty good experience, finding people, pretty quickly that they're, meet different target profiles. So that's become a lot easier.
Cool. That's neat. Yeah, I mean, the big question is, I think for people that don't have experience with it, that whether they should, provide an incentive of some sort, pay for it or a gift card or something like that. And
yeah, like I say, whatever the norms are in your company and their company, like something if it's more sort of symbolic, like a gift card or whatever, it's one thing, but paying someone $150 an hour to talk to you is another thing.
Interesting. Yeah. So another question from Harmon, which we actually touched on a little earlier, and I'm not sure whether he was on the line, but he's asking about how you approach user research for new products, like innovations, something like, in a non-existing market. Like he's giving the example of Airbnb for short-term rentals in 2008. And is there a difference in how you'd approach it compared to a more mature, settled market?
Yeah, well, I think there's not as much difference as you might think, because in both cases you're just initially you're trying to understand the user space, like who are these people and what are they trying to do, what problems do they have, and that sort of thing. And so it's not too different, because even with an established product, if you're doing research, you may be there's something new about it. Oh, we're going after a new market segment, or we're doing a new use case which we've never done before, or we're going to a different vertical. So there's, from a research perspective, it's always sort of new, and you're just trying to find out, okay, well, who are these people and what do they do, and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't say it's. I mean, there's different, obviously, aspects of research, but certainly the core thing about just trying to understand people and their needs isn't. It ought to be almost fairly transparent to sort of what you're going to use it for. You could just say, I'm not going to tell you what product I'm on, but I want you to go, get some insights from these kind of people about how they do their business and what their problems are, and you can all, yeah.
You talk about some of the different methods. Like, I think most of us are familiar with, a range of ways of getting, qualitative information and understanding, and quantitative. So, certainly interviews and open-ended questions and then surveys and actual, observation of user behavior. What are some of the methods that you've used that might be a little more unusual and that people may not have thought of?
Yeah. Well, I'll put in a plug for the usual boring methods. So there are surveys of the field, like the annual state of the art kind of surveys, and people ask, what methods are you using? And sort of, year after year, people are still mostly using, your regular interviews and surveys and that sort of thing. So like the big, in terms of the big categories of things, they're sort of, there's still have your workhorses there. There are people, there are people who use, esoteric methods, but, for myself, it's, it's kind of interesting to do that, but I'm not sure about sort of the value, like how much value you get over sort of the usual things. One, I guess, category of things like that sort of overlaps with user research would be, design thinking methods, which are become more popular in the recent years, and certainly fairly well known. So I mean, in terms of what might be new, or unfamiliar to people, those would be some of the newer methods.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And
we're getting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sure. I think there's new, it's not so much there's new methods, but there's new flavors. So like just under the general bucket of usability testing. So traditionally that was done sort of in person, and now it's moved, quite a bit to the web now, and you can do even unmoderated ones where you don't even have to be there. It's all automated. So there's a lot of, at the sort of the smaller level, there's a lot of, innovation and change, but it's still, at the core, you're still trying to just give someone a task to do and watch them do it and see what struggles they have. And
yeah. So there's a couple of questions coming in around career path. So maybe let's shift gears slightly there. So Dolores is asking, how did getting your master's degree impact your career? And does this path still have benefit today for up and coming UX researchers with so much accessible information on the internet?
Yeah, I would say in this day and age, like a master's degree is not definitely not an important thing. I wouldn't think. When I was going through, which is several years ago, let's say, there wasn't really a lot of there wasn't a lot of specialized programs and training and that sort of thing, and most of the skills you would get from a research perspective was just doing research, in general, and just applying those research skills to this here. But now, I mean, a very common career path to get into design research would be taking some design degree or certificate or whatnot. And any program I could imagine would have one or more courses specifically on user research. So people will get exposed that way. And not that you can't get in through other ways, but I found, at least in some of the companies I'm familiar with, well, I guess there's a couple of different companies. So I've seen some larger companies. Some companies are very big on credentials, so you got to have the right credentials. And did you go to D school and in the right D school and get the right things? And I would say in those places, if you don't have the right credentials, probably you're not going to get too far. Lots of other companies I know, people have just all these random kind of backgrounds, like history or whatnot. Like how did you get from here to there? And so somehow, I guess they're well thought of in their company, and so I don't know how they got there in particular, but certainly. So I would say if you have some educational training, which is not at all relevant, you just maybe try to find some of those people who've doing the work who have some non-traditional background and find how they got there. But there's certainly many people with, people say, fashion degree, like degree in fashion design is like, so literally, people are coming in from all kinds of different backgrounds.
Interesting. Well, another question here is related to what tips might you give to new grads, for example, in computer science, who want to break into the UX industry?
Yeah, so I would say, just the same as before. So, I mean, like I would say, if you don't have there's lots of lightweight training you can get on the field in general, very specific parts of it, and so either like these short certificates or something at a college or a course or whatnot, or so it just depends how much you want to invest in it, I would guess. But there's different I don't know all the latest and greatest, but there's lots and lots of resources that for learning different different aspects of the field.
So for a computer science grad, for example, an engineer, are there any particular kind of advantages that they would bring to research that you might might be able to highlight?
Like I would say, you might think yes, but I would say, I mean, if they don't have any, I mean, there's a lot of people, in UX come from a computer science background, and they've, that's sort of the flavor they have. Um, but if you're coming from a computer science background and you didn't have any particular exposure to UX in your degree, then I wouldn't say there'd be too many advantages. I mean, everybody brings their own set of advantages, like from wherever you come from. So there'd be some obviously from computer science, but I wouldn't. For people that are looking for credentialed people, I don't think I've got a computer science degree per se would be that interesting to them.
What's probably more significant is the level of experience that they've had, the user's perspective, right?
So if did they take courses in the subject, and or maybe they did a project in that, or
So here's another interesting question from Linda. Linda's asking, if you have a team of UX generalists, which I guess means people that are maybe more trained on the design side, but none who are well developed in the research field, how would you go about better developing that skill set in a team, or even vetting a specific individual to become the researcher?
So that's a challenge that I've seen in several organizations I've been in. Is the general thought is we don't have enough of these people to go around. We need to, and it's not rocket science. So we need to scale up some people to do some of this work. And the thing I think works best is there'll be in any large team, there'll be someone who's got a natural affinity to it, they enjoy doing that, and they want opportunities to do more of it. So I would say to find those people. I would say when I've seen efforts to sort of try to impose training on people and say, okay, now you know how to do this, go off and do it. I haven't really seen a lot of success with that, because people go back to their job and they have their interests and their their pressures and whatnot. So they not too much comes of it. So I think you really need to find someone who's got the interest, and you can easily get the skill if you have the interest.
So do you think it's something that if your team is large enough that it's somebody that you would more or less dedicate to be a specialist in that, or do you think there's a reason to sort of distribute it over the team if everybody's interested?
I would I guess it'd be a continuum. I guess I would like on a large team, I would just get a poll of who's interested in this and to what degree, and so maybe you could define it like on a design team. Say, okay, we're going to have this user research role positions. Anybody want to apply for it? So maybe there's someone on your team who wants to sort of go in sort of both feet, or to say it's not a full-time role, but we have this short-term or part-time research need. Who wants to do it or skill up on it or whatnot?
So I hear you saying that there's quite a bit of education and resources out there if you have the interest, and so really what you want to look for is somebody that's motivated and enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, I would say, and it has some some minimal amount of natural sort of aptitude for the field.
Okay, but, cool. Let's see, and there's also a question here about sort of the transition between a research background or even a designer role moving into product management. So, I mean, I can certainly provide some perspective on that, but from your perspective as a researcher, what do you think, the kind of core competencies that those people would bring to product management, as you understand it, would be advantageous for them?
Well, I think, like as you mentioned, I think there is a fair amount of overlap. If you look at sort of the complete product manager, there's certainly a lot of talk and aspiration to take the user's perspective and support it, and so certainly from those, someone from research background would be very strong in those skill areas. obviously, but yeah, I'm not sure that I'm not really sure that a product or a researcher would. Well, you know, there's all kinds of flavors of researchers, and I think to the extent that, so two things a researcher can bring, if you know, one is obviously that user perspective. The other is, you know, part of a researcher's job is being an advocate, or really a pain in someone's side. Because I think a lot of research is not like going to do the research, but it's, once you've done it, is keeping it on the radar, because everybody's, whether it's a product manager, the designer, whatever, they have their own things to worry about, and sort of, you know, the insights or the focus on the user kind of can fade into the background. And so part of the researcher's job between studies is to sort of keep that on the radar. And so, and persuading people, and, you know, chasing after people, and that sort of thing. So there's a, you know, fair amount of that in product management as well, trying to just align people, or you know, keep things moving, and that kind of thing. So there'll be some skills there for sure.
Yeah, which actually nicely segues into another question that I had for you, and that's that when we think about what makes a successful product team today, it's really evolved and brings together critical perspectives from, you know, a number of different areas. Obviously, business objectives, the user experience, and technical feasibility is kind of the typical, you know, triangle that we talk about. Can you tell us about some of your experiences where you've had challenges in working with a team to sort of align them, or integrate the research? And you mentioned before something about, you know, the willingness to change your thinking, or something like that. Tell us about some challenges you've encountered with that.
Sure. So I think there's a answer to this question at a couple of different levels. So one is imagine a team of these, you know, three leads, or, you know, technology, product management, design. Coming into that circle, there's a question of sort of, you know, how you fit in, and one challenge is it's more organizational. Is research sort of the junior? Are we sort of under the design umbrella, or are we sort of a peer? You know, is there four people at the table, or, you know, and that's sort of more an organizational discussion, but, you know, there's a couple of different models there. So I guess, you know, people need to be clear about, are you, you know, just how big a seat at the table you have. Then the other thing is at the smaller level. So let's say, you know, these people said, you know, we need a research study to study, you know, such and such. So then the researchers brought in to lead that effort. So they're sort of the leader of this smaller team. So within that small team, part of the research job is to align those people there. So first is getting the right people on this, you know, little research team, you know, getting all the perspectives there, which is, you know, very, very aligned with the product management of trying to, you know, understand the different voices and make sure that we have all the different voices represented. And then you know, once they're there, there'll be a lot of different opinions and perspectives. So trying to you know, align them, but you know, in like a research style would be, you know, trying to explore sort of why is it that these people have these different perspectives, and like, and what can we do about it? So like an example would be, so one project, so we had two, I was brought in to do some research, and there's two key stakeholders, and one person's view was, the research, we really want something short term. We're evolving our product in the short term, and we need some research to support that. And the other person's view was more long term. Said, well, yeah, sure, we're doing this tactical thing in the short term, but in the long term, you know, we have these other things we need to learn about or study. So really, we should sort of, you know, take a long term, big picture. So there's no right answer. There's just like a metaphor I use as sort of a lens on a camera. Like, are we zooming in on something, or are we taking a big sort of, you know, wide angle on this thing? And so, and so that's just the kind of thing that you really need to be aligned on in a research planning session, because those are very different kind of studies.
Different questions fundamentally,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, but they had like the same wording, but I said, well, like, yeah, you can answer that like in the short term, here's the answer, in the long term, it's a different answer, right? So even if the wording is actually the same, it's like, well, you mean different things. So what we, through discussion, we sort of, people came to realize that. What we end up doing is say, well, really, we're talking about two different studies. We have kind of a short-term, focus here. We'll sort of answer that, and we'll separately, zoom out and look at the bigger, longer-term picture and look at that. Another, like an example of alignment was, a team comes in and says, well, we want feedback on this product. And then through discussion, I say, well, there's really, from a user perspective, you have two parts of your product. You have a web portal, which is used by some users, and you have like a mobile app, which is used by different kind of users. So if you want to study the product, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about both of them or one of them? And then through discussions, we learn, okay, what are the priorities? What's more important? And this is really among stakeholders. Among themselves, they decide, what's more important to our product here. Not, are we investing in our mobile app or our portal, or is this user segment having more important than that one, or that sort of thing? And then come to some resolution again about, these are in fact, apples and oranges, and we're going to study one or the other. So I guess what I try and do is, in alignment, is to try to make some useful distinctions for people to say, well, it's not just like the product or the experience. It's either long-term or short-term, or this part of that part, or this issue or that issue. And what are we really trying to do here?
Nice. We have a few minutes left, and I want to drill into a little bit sort of more, the steps that product managers need to understand in working with a research activity. So can you talk about how you break down a research activity into stages, and what can product managers do to best work with the researcher at each stage?
Yeah, great. Yeah. And as I mentioned, really a successful research activity is one where the product manager really is involved at every step. So we could, break it into three steps. So one is just, planning before you go collect data. Then there's the execution, the actual recruiting and collecting of data. And then there's afterwards, okay, we have this data. What does it mean, and what are we going to do about it? And I think like a product manager is really key at each point. So we talked about how when you're planning, you're really trying to figure, okay, what's the actual question here? And the product manager, or collectively, is really the person that provides guidance. Okay, this is a priority, or that's a priority, or this is, you want to delineate the scope here. In execution, we touched this already. So recruiting is a very important sort of activity, and they need to. It needs to be clear on what their role is, and if they sign up to do something, they need to deliver on it. I remember one project where, this guy was super gung-ho. Says, "I'm just super. This is great. I can't wait to do this, and I'm going to go. I know some great customers. I'm going to get them for you, and it's going to be great." I said, "Wow, really, it's kind of harder than you may think. No. I know this guy, and I'm going to have lunch with them, next week, and I'm sure they're chomping at the bit." So okay, well, knock yourself out. And he wasn't able to come up with a single person. Like he just. So I would say, if you are, it's great to be enthusiastic and take it on, but to realize you got to deliver on it if you're going to. And that's why I prefer to say, well, thanks for the offer, but I just as soon sort of do the heavy lifting myself, so I know what's involved and I can get it done. Then finally we get to the last part, which is, okay, we have this data. What are we going to do about it? And there's a couple things. So I would say. It is very sort of kind of soft skill sort of thing, but you need to have a receptive and productive mindset to results. So there's a lot of unproductive reactions people have to results, like, I already knew that, or you didn't talk to enough people, or just different unproductive things that people safe for different reasons to results. So, to the extent that as the audience, if you can try to sort of get something from that. And like I said, we talked about before, and I do sympathize. It can be very difficult because if you have in your mind, this is kind of this is my belief of customers and their needs and things, and you see something different. It's natural to say, well, I'm not sure if I'm buying this because it's not what I thought it was. But I guess it's kind of like therapy. I guess you need to be willing to change your thinking. You can't change the world. You can only change your thinking, right? And say, well, okay, well, maybe it's not quite what I thought it was.
Right.
I remember one example where this, the research sponsor. So this product had different parts to it, and he said we're getting some really bad customer feedback, and it's this part over here. The research came back and said, well, yeah, that part's a problem, but it's really the bigger problem is over here. And he was just like floored by that because it just all his anecdotal evidence so far, he'd never heard that this other part was a problem. And now he's hearing sort of this unwelcome news that he had to sort of fix this problem, that he didn't know he had. But I mean, to his credit, he did come around eventually to it, but it's a tough pill to swallow, I thought.
Nice, yeah. So actually that leads into an interesting question that Anka posed on the chat, saying that in any extensive research, analysis and synthesis are closely intertwined. So is there someone who should do both, or what are the challenges that we should keep in mind if you need to divide that work?
Yeah, I don't think about it dividing so much as just trying to get as many people involved as possible. So, when it's I just use the plain term, just trying to make sense of the data. There's different terms for it, but just there's all this data. So what does it mean, and what are we going to do about it? And I just find the more, especially the people who are going to have to do something about it should be involved, because they're going to have to sort of live with that afterwards. So if they can be part of the what does this mean sort of thinking, then that'll be much, when we come up with the final version of it, there won't be any sort of bad surprises there.
So again, very much a collaborative activity. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like one thing I do is, and it depends on the logistics, how you can do this, but it can be very effortful to do the various parts of, analyzing the data. So I try to break it, like, I do the heavy lifting, but I try to give people some, sort of manageable subset of it to do, so they can, they can bring their own voices, say, hey, this is what I think of the data I looked at. This is kind of what I think it means. And I try to overlap it so there can be a conversation among different people. Say, well, I looked at the same data and I got this from it. And people get wildly different things, from especially kind of qualitative data. And it's not there's anyone's right or wrong. It's just different ways of looking at it. And so just that activity of different people discussing why they thought this meant something, or okay, well, the guy said this, but I thought when he said that, he meant this other thing because before he'd said something, and I forgot he said, so people get a lot more out of it if they have to chew on it themselves and then sort of discuss with somebody else sort of what it meant and why it meant and that sort of thing. So I try to.
Right. Well, we have time for just maybe one more question, and I wanted to get your insights onto sort of other resources that people could use. But before that, and this is a way longer discussion, but are there, things that you watch out for, biases that, you can give a tip to product managers about, how to kind of identify a bias and sort of work with it, or,
yeah.
Through conversation, obviously, but other ways?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I would say we're all biased, and so the main thing I would say is get different people involved, as I was describing earlier, because then hopefully people's biases will cancel out. That's sort of one thing, and the other thing is maybe and that's one, researchers can bring many values, and one of them, if you're the researchers coming in from the outside into the team, they can bring a fresh, not unbiased perspective, but at least a different biased perspective than everybody on the team who's drinking the Kool-Aid has, and say, hey, well, so I would try to, just generally try to inject as many different kinds of perspectives into the work as possible, because everybody will shine a different light on things.
Great. We're going to have to wrap up, but I did want you to tell us if you have one sort of favorite resource or recommended book or course or something on that can help people with UX research.
Yeah, well, I've got several, and I'll send you a fuller list later, and you can put it somewhere. But I would say, like for product managers, I would suggest as a strategy, find some product management material that that talks about user research from a product management perspective. And sort of the one I'm very familiar with, the author is Roman Pichler. He's got the book Strategize, and probably among others. But that's a book I definitely recommend, because he's talking about product strategy and product roadmaps, and he says here's how, he's got a framework and he's got all these steps, and just in there he's got different research activities. Well, here, do some personas or do some problem interviews or whatever. It's just embedded into the process. It's not really called out as a specific thing. It's just sort of. So I would say that'd be the place to start.
That's great. That's really helpful. I'd love to get that list from you, maybe sort of a curated list, and we'll post it on the site so that people can get access to it. So we're gonna have to wrap up. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and your insights and experience in helping us understand this a little better.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.